I'll revert to my little MC hat here. Our next presentation will be by Dr. Sergei Khan, a good friend of mine, and I'll ask him to introduce himself to you. Sergei.
I'm very excited to be here. I've never spoken in front of so many Tlingit people and other native people, but I feel that many of you here know me, and that gives me confidence. But for those of you who don't, in a proper Tlingit fashion, I'll tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. I was born in Russia about 40 years ago, which I guess makes me an Anushi Yadi. But came to the States about 20 years ago and studied anthropology as a graduate student. And I always wanted to come to this part of Alaska to study Tlingit history and Tlingit culture because there was that very interesting Russian connection, the oldest European Tlingit connection that we know of. I think culturally and historically one of the richest encounters between Europeans and Native people in Alaska. And with its tragic stories, but also with some good things. And one of the positive developments of that encounter, which I think we saw this morning as we were listening to Father Michael Williams bless this conference, is the Russian Church. And how deep into Tlingit history that goes, you could see that people could still sing in Russian. So I came to Sitka in '79 to really study both traditional Tlingit culture before European influence and the history of the Tlingit-Russian relations, especially in terms of religious history. And I went up to SCA to see Andy Hope, who was the general manager at that time. And Andy was very good to me. He was friendly, and he didn't turn me away, as some of my predecessors have been turned away by some Tlingit people, and I think for good reasons. And through Andy, I met his stepfather's family, the Littlefields, particularly Charlotte Littlefield Young, who was the president of the St. Michael Sisterhood. And eventually, that was a bad year for the family. Several members had died. And we became close friends, and Charlotte adopted me into the box house, the koo.eex, at a memorial for her brothers and her uncle Bill Peters in April of 1980. And that connection continues to this very day. That is my family. I feel Sitka is my town. So, Shakunda stu yuchadu asak, koo.eex, Kaagwaantaan, Sitka. And most recently, just a year and a half ago, I was at a memorial party for another great friend of mine, my teacher, Jimmie George, Daklawadi, in Angoon, because after spending a year in Sitka, I also lived in Angoon for a summer in 1980. And there, Mark Jacobs, another killer whale leader and gentleman from Angoon who lives in Sitka, he decided that a killer whale name from his brother, Harvey, should be given to me. I didn't expect it, but Mark and I also have very, very strong ties, and that name is koo.eex. So that's sort of the history. What I want to do in this presentation is to talk about trying to put together a list of sources on Tlingit history, both written sources and oral sources, recorded, and archival sources. And Andy asked me to do that, and I've been sort of playing with this idea of a bibliography, a list of sources. And I think it's sort of my personality. I always squirrel away bits and pieces of paper and Xeroxes of articles and tapes I've made. So my own personal archive has become quite substantial. And in my work, all the way back to the 70s, I found that the most productive way to do this kind of work is to combine archival research, and it helps when you read Russian. It's your own language, of course, but also reading French and German, as I happen to do, and English sources, American sources. Combine that with talking to people. And I think some of the most interesting work in anthropology has been done that way. When I was in Sitka, for example, in 1979-80, I would read the Russian Church archives, look up at the names, and the nice thing about the Russian Church archives, they often listed Tlingit names and Russian church names that were given. So you could identify some of the people. Then I take the papers back to Charlotte, to Charlie Joseph Kotlet. I'm very happy to see Athol Mack and his daughter here. Charlie was another very good friend. Go to Albert Davis, go to Tom Young, Annie Dick, Mary Marks, all the old-timers who were very active members of the church, and try to read them the names. And they would say, yeah, that was a Kohomin, or that was a Kaagwaantaan, and this was a Chukanadi man. And you begin to see the sources, the written sources begin to tell you a lot more. All of a sudden, you begin to see certain patterns. They weren't just randomly, for example, you probably know, many of you, about the two brotherhoods in Sitka, the St. Michael and St. Gabriel, the orthodox brotherhoods. There are the pictures of them that the Merrill took in the early 1900s. And I couldn't figure out why did they have to have two brotherhoods? And the Russian sources don't tell you that, and I think the priests had no clue or didn't want to talk about it. But eventually, through working with the elders, we established that there was a very clear presence in the St. Michael of the Tloknachadi and in St. Gabriel of the Kiksadi. And then their Kaagwaantaan and other eagle spouses were divided. So the brotherhoods reflected the social structure, the traditional Sitka Tlingit social structure, which again supported my idea that the Russian church made a lot more sense at that time in the 19th century to the Tlingit culture than any other mission. And there were other things. I wanted to know who were the most active leaders at the time who supported the church, where they met in the Sitka village. What were these brotherhoods meetings about? What were they talking about? Which language were they using? Who were the Tlingit men and women who helped the priests translate the sermons from Russian into Tlingit? So that the history of the Russian church becomes much more of a Tlingit history, not just a Russian missionary history. And without the help of the elders, this could not have been done. Absolutely. I then tried to do the same thing in Angoon, and I didn't spend as much time there. I regret that. But with Jimmie George's help, Lydia George was very, very helpful that summer. I always appreciate that. She's here. Matthew Fred was also very helpful. Bessie George Jim, and a number of other folks. Many of them are not with us. Mary Willis taught me a lot about the church history. We did the same thing, trying to fill in the gaps in the written record. But occasionally the written record helped because for some events there didn't seem to be any native memory, or the people were already gone, but the archive is there and you can reconstruct the names. And I'll say more about that in the workshop on how we can work together. And I'm very much hoping that those of you who have some historical information, not just on the Russian church in Southeast, but other events that may be of mutual interest to scholars and native community, that we can work together. But going back to my bibliography, what I'd like to say is that, let me just get my listings. I think that there's a lot of very valuable information in the written record and in the published books, even though they're authored by non-Tlingit. And if you notice, when Andy was giving his talk just before me, he would refer to Emmons and De Laguna and Swanton. And of course, what he's referring to is the native voices, the Tlingit people who had been interviewed by those anthropologists. So over the years, of course, I've heard a lot of you comment on, who is this guy? What did he write about us? What did Oberg know about us? What did Olson know about us? And I think some of that criticism is very valid. And in many of these works, particularly those written by non-professional people, there are biases, there are ethnocentric judgments that by our modern standards we don't want to see anymore, we want to reject. But at the same time, I don't think we want to throw away the baby with the water, because those people of the past, even the most ethnocentric missionaries and government agents, if they happen to be talking to your ancestors, and if they got the information right, the things they recorded could be of help today in reconstructing history, in documenting history, creating tribal archives, tribal museum, the kind of thing that I think Andy had in mind for this conference and the other organizers. So what I'd like to do in this bibliographic book, which eventually I hope to put together, is not simply list sources as others have done. We have some lists of sources on Tlingit culture. But to have the bibliography annotated, which means you would see a paragraph at least explaining who the author was, where he or she came from, their cultural background, their ethnic, their political background, what were they doing in the Native community? Because those things do make a difference. Were they missionaries? Were they government agents? Were they traders? Were they married to a Tlingit person? Were they adopted in a Tlingit clan? That is an important factor. Who did they talk to? Did they identify the names of the Tlingit informants, consultants, teachers that they talked to? That's the kind of bibliography that I think would be much more helpful to you, I hope, and certainly to students and scholars and other folks. There are other things that should go into how we evaluate sources. And this kind of evaluating of sources or contextualizing the sources is very crucial. What was the author's attitude towards the Tlingit people? I translated this book in the mid-'80s, Father Anatoly Kaminsky's observation on Tlingit Indians. And Father Anatoly was a Russian priest in St. Michael's Dean in Sitka in the mid-1890s. And he was a pretty good observer. I think he had some close ties with some Tlingit leaders, and he mentions some of their names in the book, mainly Sitka folks. At the same time, he had his own biases, and I researched his biography. I tried to figure out where his attitudes came from. And for example, I compared him to Saint Innocent, Father Veniaminov, who was in Sitka about 60 years earlier, who I think was much more sensitive to native culture and more open-minded. Kaminsky was an urban St. Petersburg gentleman, well-educated, but had certain condescending attitude. So in my introduction to the book, I try to explain how we can read between the lines or separate his own personal observations, his guessing, or his judgmental comments that are, I think, inappropriate from some very valuable historical facts. And I just want to give you one example. We don't have much time, but in one section of the book, he talks about a staff that was given to him by the Kaagwaantaan clan, particularly by a man named Nikifor Kulkita, which I think is a fairly well-known name in Sitka, who was a very active member of a church brotherhood. And it was presented to the priest as a gift. And I'm still puzzled why the Kaagwaantaans would do that, whether they were trying to get rid of something that was causing controversy between different groups. The priest, of course, interpreted it as the Kaagwaantaans were giving up their heathen ways. They were stopping their potlatching and all that. And of course, it sounds hilarious if you think this was 1890. But that's how he wanted to interpret it that way. But along with the staff, which Kaminsky says is in St. Petersburg in the church museum, and I'm still trying to track down, maybe it still exists. Along with the staff, they gave him a story. And the story goes through about 5 generations of the Kaagwaantaan families going all the way back to Huna, to the original home, the Icy Straits. And each time the staff was passed from one clan head to the next, they would have a ceremony and a memorial feast with slaves being given away as gifts. Eventually property being given away, and it traces it all the way down to Kaminsky's time, the 1890s in Sitka. And so this kind of account could not have been made up. The names are there. I've checked them out with Dick and Nora Downhauer, with Jeff Lear. Everything matches up. So I think for the sake of those 3 pages of Kaagwaantaan history, we can put up with Kaminsky's nonsensical comments on what he thought, Tlingit language was about, which he didn't understand very well, or he didn't think that certain Tlingit customs were very, appropriate from his point of view, and so forth. There are a few other well-known anthropologists, and I just picked a couple from who worked in this area or tried to work in this area. I want to make it more interesting to our hosts, the people of Kaagwaantaan. And I'd be very curious if we have time for questions or in the workshops, if you folks can add a little more to what I've read about these anthropologists in their own work. And I'll just start with Kraus, a German traveler, well-known book. It's available in